Rich man humiliates a janitor at a restaurant. Unaware Morgan Freeman is watching. You missed a spot. The tone was abrasive and condescending. A polished leather foot slipped into the puddle that David Carter, a 60-year-old janitor, was sweeping, splattering filthy water upon his uniform before he could even turn around. Is respect earned by character? Comment respect. Or is status all that matters? Comment status. There was laughter. Not from the whole restaurant, but from one table in particular, that of Robert Hughes, a man who valued money and thought nothing of anyone below his tax bracket. David gripped the handle of the mop and swallowed hard. He has previously dealt with such individuals. He was aware of the plan: accept the insult, remain silent, and continue working. However, neither Robert nor David were aware that there was another person observing. Someone whose voice was enough to fill a room with stillness. Have you ever witnessed someone being unjust to someone else simply because of their occupation? How would you respond? Tell us in the comments section. In New York City, it was just another Thursday night. With its crystal chandeliers, excellent wines, and waiters who glided like ghosts, their polished shoes gliding soundlessly across marble floors, the expensive restaurant hummed with calm elegance. Wearing a basic janitor's uniform, David Carter had been employed here for almost 10 years. He could as well have been invisible, but he wasn't. Wiping up spills, straightening seats, and trying to blend in as he went carefully between tables. It was always that way. Janitors were not looked at. They examined them, unless they wanted someone to blame, of course. Do I have to do everything myself? The voice echoed through the dining room, annoyed. Robert Hughes, a self-styled success story, a real estate tycoon, and someone who thought that wealth equated to superiority, was staring down at David with scarcely concealed disdain. I pay $300 for a steak and I have to watch this guy swab the floor like some sad little peasant? David tensed, but he remained silent. He simply kept working with his head down. Uncomfortably, the diner fell silent. Sensing the tension, a few people moved in their chairs, but none raised their voice. Nobody ever did. However, then, a deep, distinct voice pierced the silence. That's enough. Robert's self-satisfied face wavered. He turned to see himself looking into Morgan Freeman's serene, unblinking eyes. The room held its breath. David kept his head down and grabbed a rag to dab at the wet marks on his uniform. Robert wasn't finished, though. I've always wondered what makes people choose jobs like this. I mean, really? What happened in your life that led you here? Robert pondered as he turned back to his table. David took a brief break before carrying on with his cleaning. This was not the first time he had heard it, sometimes in whispers, other times loud enough for everyone to hear. Robert grinned, interpreting the quiet as a sign to go on. He continued by swirling his whiskey. It's kind of sad, isn't it? A grown man wiping floors while the rest of us actually contribute to society. David did not respond. However, another person did. Morgan Freeman stood up and carefully pushed back his chair. He didn't make noise. He didn't demand attention or beat his hand against the table. He just moved forward, coolly and methodically, until he was standing directly next to David. Robert's arrogant face trembled for the first time that night. There was silence in the restaurant. You didn't see Morgan Freeman standing in front of you every day when you glanced up. Robert blinked, covering his astonishment with a short laugh. Well, this just got interesting. Morgan's strong voice was powerful but silky, and he cocked his head slightly. Tell me something, Mr. Hughes. Do you think humiliating someone makes you powerful? Robert pretended to be amused and sat back in his chair. Oh, come on, it's just a joke. Lighten up. Morgan didn't grin. A joke at whose expense? With a dismissive wave of his hand, Robert scoffed. Look, I don't need a lecture from an actor. You play wise men on screen, but this is real life. Morgan gave a contemplative nod. You're right, this is real life. And in real life, a man's character isn't measured by his money. It's measured by how he treats people who can do nothing for him. The diner echoed with a whisper. Robert paused his grin. He appeared uneasy for the first time. In an attempt to restore control, he asked, "Is that so? And what do you know about hard work? You've been rich for decades. You don't know what it's like to struggle." Morgan approached slowly. "I know what it's like to be unseen," he stated. The words hit differently. Robert paused too. Morgan nodded to David, who had become motionless. "I know what it's like to work jobs where people look through you, not at you. I know what it's like to be dismissed before you even open your mouth. And I know this," Morgan said. "This man deserves the same respect you do. Maybe even more, because unlike you, he doesn't have to step on others to feel important." Like a thick blanket, the words' weight descended upon the room. Robert Hughes failed to make a comeback for the first time during the evening. David didn't know how to proceed. No one, particularly not Morgan Freeman, had ever spoken up for him in such a way. He sensed that everyone in the restaurant was watching and waiting for them. Robert's fingers clenched around his glass as his expression grew gloomy. This annoyed him. He was the one who was accustomed to having authority and setting the rules. Now, though, they were calling him out now, and he was unsure of how to handle that. Robert had an option. He had two options. He could continue to act like the strong guy, or he could confront his own reality. He would never forget the lesson in respect that would follow. "You missed a spot." The tone was abrasive and condescending. A polished leather foot slipped into the puddle that David Carter, a 60-year-old janitor, was sweeping, splattering filthy water upon his uniform before he could even turn around. There was laughter, not from the whole restaurant, but from one table in particular, that of Robert Hughes, a man who valued money and thought nothing of anyone below his tax bracket. David gripped the handle of the mop and swallowed hard. He has previously dealt with such individuals. He was aware of the plan: accept the insult, remain silent, and continue working. However, neither Robert nor David were aware that there was another person observing, someone whose voice was enough to fill a room with stillness. Have you ever witnessed someone being unjust to someone else simply because of their occupation? How would you respond? Tell us in the comments section. In New York City, it was just another Thursday night, with its crystal chandeliers, excellent wines, and waiters who glided like ghosts. Their polished shoes gliding soundlessly across marble floors, the expensive restaurant hummed with calm elegance. Wearing a basic janitor's uniform, David Carter had been employed here for almost 10 years. He could as well have been invisible, but he wasn't. Wiping up spills, straightening seats, and trying to blend in as he went carefully between tables. It was always that way. Janitors were not looked at. They examined them. Unless they wanted someone to blame, of course. "Do I have to do everything myself?" The voice echoed through the dining room, annoyed. Robert Hughes, a self-styled success story, a real estate tycoon, and someone who thought that wealth equated to superiority, was staring down at David with scarcely concealed disdain. "I pay $300 for a steak, and I have to watch this guy swab the floor like some sad little peasant." David tensed, but he remained silent. He simply kept working with his head down. Uncomfortably, the diner fell silent. Sensing the tension, a few people moved in their chairs, but none raised their voice. Nobody ever did. However, then, a deep, distinct voice pierced the silence. "That's enough." Robert's self-satisfied face wavered. He turned to see himself looking into Morgan Freeman's serene, unblinking eyes. The room held its breath. All his life, Robert Hughes had felt that wealth made him invincible. He would never forget the lesson he was about to learn tonight. There was silence in the restaurant. Morgan Freeman, whose voice alone could command a room without ever raising it, was now the center of attention. The previously self-assured real estate tycoon, Robert Hughes, squirmed uneasily in his seat. He wasn't the most powerful person in the room for the first time that evening. Morgan stepped forward slowly, his face inscrutable. He wasn't angry. No, he didn't need to be angry. His mere presence was significant enough. Robert forced a laugh as he tried to gather himself. "Look, I don't know what kind of Hollywood lesson you're about to give me, but I don't see why you're getting involved." Morgan's head cocked slightly. "You don't?" Robert crossed his arms and leaned back. The man pointed to David, who was still holding his mop, his knuckles white with stress, and said, "No, this is a business. People come here to enjoy fine dining, not to watch that." Morgan's eyes remained fixed. "Tell me something, Mr. Hughes. When you walk into this restaurant, do you ever stop to think about how it stays clean?" Robert laughed. "I pay for it to be clean." Morgan gave a nod. "And who cleans it?" Evidently unprepared for the question, Robert paused. "People like him." Morgan stepped forward once more. "And what makes you think they deserve less respect than you do?" Like a noose, the tension in the room tightened. Even the people who had been eating in silence were now completely engaged in the discussion. Robert gave an eye roll. "Come on, let's not pretend. Some people just end up on the bottom and some people end up on top. That's life." As though he had heard this speech 1,000 times, Morgan sighed slightly. "And tell me, what exactly puts you on top?" Robert grinned. "Money, power, influence. You know, the things that actually matter." After considering the response for a while, Morgan shook his head gently. "No, Mr. Hughes, that's where you're wrong." Robert's mouth clenched. "Oh yeah? Then what does?" Morgan spoke steadily. "Character." Robert shook his head and scoffed. "Character? That's rich coming from someone who plays make-believe for a living." Unfazed, Morgan grinned. "I do tell stories for a living, and you know what I've learned? The best stories aren't about wealth or status. They're about the people who stand tall even when the world tries to push them down. People like David." David, who had been mute during this entire ordeal, glanced up in disbelief. That was the only way anyone had ever talked about him. Morgan faced Robert once more. "Tell me, Mr. Hughes, if you lost everything tomorrow, your money, your properties, your influence, who would still stand by you?" Robert paused his grin. Lowering his voice just enough to allow the room to lean in, Morgan took a step closer. "Would your business partners return your calls? Would your friends still invite you to their mansions? Or would they move on to the next man with deeper pockets?" Robert bobbed his throat. Morgan stopped him in his tracks. "Now, look at David. He may not have your wealth, but I can promise you this. If he lost everything, he would still have dignity. Because dignity isn't something you buy, Mr. Hughes. It's something you earn." There was silence in the room. Even Robert, despite his conceit, did not return right away. He was stunned for the first time in a long time. A waiter walked slowly over to the table. "Sir, should we bring out your meal?" At first, Robert remained silent. His thoughts were too fast for him to keep up with, so he just stared at Morgan. Were he truly so blind? At last, he let out a short breath and gestured with his hand. "No, I'm not hungry." He took several $100 out of his wallet and tossed them upon the table. He murmured, "For the janitor," and got to his feet. However, Morgan spoke again before he could go. "That's not the point, Mr. Hughes." Robert scowled as he turned around. "What?" David was still standing there with his mop in hand when Morgan moved to stand next to him. "If you truly understood what I was saying, you wouldn't be trying to buy your way out of it." Robert paused. "Then what am I supposed to do?" Morgan's mouth curled into the tiniest grin. "Try something radical. Say, 'I'm sorry.'" The diner echoed with a whisper. At his sides, Robert's fingers twitched. Say sorry to a housekeeper in public? His pride begged him to turn around. However, he hesitated for some reason because of the steady, patient gaze Morgan Freeman was giving him, as if he already knew what Robert would do before he did. Robert Hughes took the difficult decision for the first time in his life. He looked across to David. "Look, He let out a breath as though he were squeezing it out. "I was wrong. I treated you like you were beneath me and you're not." Uncertain if he had merely dreamed such words, David blinked. Robert took a swallow. "I'm sorry." The restaurant fell silent. Then there was a little unanticipated applause, just one table, then another, and yet another. Embarrassment scorched Robert's face, but somehow it didn't feel horrible. It felt natural. Morgan grinned. That's a start. He put a hand on David's shoulder and turned to face him. You've handled this with more grace than most men ever could. Still in disbelief, David managed to speak. I was just doing my job. Morgan laughed. No, David, you were doing something much greater than that. You were teaching a lesson, one that all of us needed to hear. David had sparkling eyes. Thank you, Mr. Freeman. Morgan gave a nod. Just promise me one thing. David stood up. Anything. Morgan's tone grew softer. Never let anyone make you feel small again. David took a deep breath. I won't. Morgan grinned. Good. He looked back at Robert. And you? Robert took a deep breath and exhaled steadily and slowly. I have some thinking to do. Morgan laughed. That's a good place to start. The restaurant would never forget the night Morgan Freeman reminded them all of something basic, so he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Status is not a factor in respect. It has to do with character. Robert Hughes slumped back in his chair as the doors closed behind him. He had entered that restaurant with the idea that he was untouchable because of his wealth. He had left with the realization that unless he made the decision to improve, it made him nothing at all. And Morgan Freeman's words reverberated again, somewhere in the stillness of his mind. A strong man lifts others up. A weak man tears them down. For years, Robert Hughes had been breaking people down. For the first time tonight, he thought, what if he tried to lift someone up instead? Outside the restaurant, Robert Hughes sat in his car and gazed at his image in the rearview mirror. The man in front of him didn't appear to be as strong as he had previously believed. He had spent years measuring success in terms of wealth, power, and influence. That illusion had been broken tonight by a great actor and a mere janitor. With a short sigh, he drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. Although the apology had been challenging, it didn't feel incorrect. It was the first honest thing he had done in a long time, if anything. David Carter was still attempting to comprehend what had just transpired inside the restaurant. He had been unnoticed for years, a mere employee in the backdrop of other people's lives. But he had been spotted tonight, in front of a whole room full of strangers. Morgan Freeman observed how the moment had descended upon everyone as he stood by the door. He had witnessed this before. A man who understood that respect is earned by his treatment of others, not by his wealth. At last, David said something. Do you think people like him can change? Looking toward the window where Robert was still sitting in his car, Morgan grinned. Everyone has the capacity to change. The question is, will they choose to? David gave a contemplative nod. I guess we'll see. Morgan faced him once more. And you? David's eyebrows went up. Me? Morgan's face became softer. Are you ever going to see yourself the way the rest of us do? David looked down at the mop he was still holding as he gulped. He had allowed his profession, his uniform, and the way people like Robert denigrated him to define him for years. However, tonight, something had changed tonight. He stood somewhat higher and squared his shoulders. I think it's time I did. Morgan grinned. Good. His voice reverberated in David's memory as he set off into the night, leaving a restaurant that would never be the same. Respect isn't about money, it's about how you treat people. True power isn't about status, it's about how you make others feel. Through this story, we realize respect is not about status, money, or power, it's about character. Robert Hughes believed that wealth gave him the right to look down on others, but Morgan Freeman reminded him of a deeper truth. A strong man lifts others up, while a weak man tears them down. David Carter spent years being overlooked, but in one night he was seen. Not just by Morgan, but by an entire room. This story teaches us that no job makes a person less worthy, and real power isn't about control, it's about how you make others feel. Because in the end, it's not your wealth that defines you, it's the respect you earn.